My name is Dr. Harold Isaacs, and I'm Professor Emeritus of History here at GSW. And I started the Third World Series in 1981. So we're celebrating our 28th anniversary, or at least in February. I think it was February 18th we had the first meeting over in Roney 301 with presentations by three people that are now retired. Of course, tonight's the World Food Crisis, and let me say this, next month, October 8th, it's a month from tonight, we'll have a program on major developments in Iran, Afghanistan, and Iraq, featuring three of our faculty members, Brian Smith, Brian Parkinson, and Richard Hall. And in fact, they're here this evening, so I've introduced them already. You can read about the Third World Studies in here. I'm not going to go on and brag about it. I think it is an important component of our academic life on campus. And, you know, we feel it's very beneficial to people who participate in it, students, faculty members, and so forth. And in fact, the Association Third World Studies, which was founded on this campus, is going to have its 26th meeting. It's the 25th anniversary, but it's the 26th meeting in Millersville, Pennsylvania, on October 26th, 28th. And you have my personal invitation to attend. If you're interested, just type in Association Third World Studies, Google it, and you'll come up with the information on our website. So we have some other people here. I want to welcome all the students. I want to thank Bob Slanker for taping this, and it'll be shown on Channel 16. He's been taping our seminars for a long time. I have some colleagues here I want to introduce. Paula Martin, she's a new faculty member in history, specializing in the history of medicine. So welcome Kyle, welcome to Third World. Appreciate your attendance. And then Brian Smith right there is a political scientist, going to speak on Afghanistan. And Donna Barger is right next to him, who is the wife of David Garrison, who is our Dean of Arts and Science. David is always here. Appreciate your support. Right up in the front are two good friends of mine, Paul Zach and Kathy Zach. And Kathy is the production person for the Journal of Third World Studies. One of my key advisors, you might say. And of course, right up here is Gary Klein and Phil Smedra. And mentioned Brian Parkinson and Richard Hall. And I don't know of any other. I think, yes, Dr. Adler. Would you please stand up? He's the new dean of the college, vice president for academic affairs. Came here from Valdosta. We welcome you. Thank you. Thank you for your attendance, support. I put sign-up sheets, yellow pads, circulated them because the people in continuing education want everybody's name so they can report it to the Board of Regents. So I appreciate you all signing your names on that. And right in the back is a good friend, I won't forget him, David Hunter. He's in education. And it's probably somebody I missed. Are there any faculty members here that I didn't mention because they're new, mainly, and I just haven't met you? Okay, well, okay. Looks like I did pretty well on that. This evening, of course, is a very important subject, world food crisis. We've all been reading about it, and we're all affected by it in one way or another, so I think we can relate to it. And we have two experts on the subject here, Gary Klein, Dr. Klein, and Dr. Smedra. And Dr. Klein has really a wonderful background. He is, of course, presently professor and chair of the Department of History and Political Science. And he earned all 3 degrees at the University of Texas, Austin. And he taught there, and he taught in West Virginia. He came here in 1990. He's an authority on development. He's written a book on development. He has another book that he's working on. He's been very active in the Association of Third World Studies and on the Journal of Third World Studies. And he was treasurer, in fact, for 9 years, and he is now president of the Association of Third World Studies. And Gary also was the first recipient of the Board of Regents Distinguished Professor for Teaching and Learning Award, 1996-1997. And so he's been very active in the association in the area of development studies and so forth. There's one omission I made. My wife's in the front row, and I want to recognize her. So,
you'll pay for that later.
Yeah, I know. I was going to say, so I don't pay for it later. But anyhow, so Dr. Klein is going to give the first presentation. Let me mention one more thing about him. He also organizes World Food Day on campus and has attended the national meetings, which are in October, right?
October 16th.
October 16th in Washington. It was last year. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming again Dr. Gary Klein, who's going to talk on the world food crisis, causes, results, and possible solutions.
Thank you, Dr. Isaacs, for that kind welcome. And thanks also. I want to say that Dr. Isaacs has done this campus a tremendous service for many, many years now. I won't say how many. But at least since the advent of this organization, ATWS, he's had these programs every semester now for 25 plus years, and I think they have almost all been excellent at every one. Students have learned, students have benefited from these, and so he's done a tremendous job on this campus. And personally, I've found him to be just a great colleague, a great friend, and a great inspiration to me. It's kept me very involved and active in this organization. We have a rather somber topic to talk about today. I wish I could be a little more cheerful about some of this. I like to bring some humor into my lectures most of the time, but this is not a very humorous issue, and it's getting worse in the world. Hunger in the 21st century is what I've entitled this. This picture, of course, I found on the internet, is a picture of, let me get the caption up here, a picture of a lady making mud cookies in Haiti. Mud cookies, literally salt and some shortening and clay. And in Haiti, this is what passes as food Of course, it's got virtually no nutrition. It just helps allay the hunger pangs a little bit. But this is what many people are reduced to in parts of the world. About over 6.5 billion people inhabit our planet now. About 1.2 billion try to exist on $1 a day income or less. And I don't know if you can really imagine that, $1 a day. Some days I walk around with no more than that in my pocket, but I certainly would have a hard time. We would find it impossible to deal with that. 2.6 billion of the world's people have to get by on $2 or less a day. So that includes the $1 a day people plus those who have no more than $2 a day. And again, we're talking about people who are very stressed, very deprived. About 860 million people in the world are undernourished. And many of these we're talking not just a little bit hungry, we're talking about people who are severely undernourished. Most of them, last figure I saw, about 75% are women or children. And that, when you think about it, is really appalling. The most vulnerable people in societies all over the world, women and children who really can't go out and get a job, and make some money and feed yourself. These are people who are dependent on us, the adults of society, those who are more fortunate. On 9/11, where we all have this burned into our consciousness, on 9/11, a little under 3,000 people died that day in the collapse of the Twin Towers. A horrible tragedy. Now imagine that we had 6 9/11s in a single day. How about 6 every day of the year? That would give you an idea of the food crisis, an idea of just how serious, how severe the problem of hunger and starvation is in the world today. This is, in effect, what's happening in the world every day. About 20,000 people starve to death or die of hunger-related illnesses. By the time we finish this program, about 1,800 people will have starved. Well, what can we do about it? The world's been talking about this problem for a long time, and it seems to be getting worse. We've been talking, what are the technical obstacles to feeding the world's people? They must be tremendous, right? We're getting further and further behind. More and more millions of people are suffering, and we've made virtually no progress on this issue for decades now. What are the technical obstacles that we face to feeding the world's people? I have taken the pains to enumerate all of them on one slide. I have a comprehensive list of all the technical obstacles. Here they are. And that's them. There are no technical obstacles. If I were talking about HIV/AIDS, we could talk about a lot of technical obstacles. No matter how many resources we throw at that issue right now, we're not going to cure it overnight. HIV/AIDS is a problem for scientists to explore. They can't figure it out, not yet. They will eventually, I'm sure. But there are no technical obstacles to feeding the world's people. Well, what are the other obstacles? What other obstacles are preventing us from addressing the issue? One, I think, is a lack of awareness. A lot of people really don't understand the issue. It looks really overwhelming when you think about it. I just described the numbers, and they're really sickening. They're really overwhelming to think that 20,000 people a day are starving to death. That's pretty daunting. But the fact is that the world has enough food for everyone and has for a long time. If we just considered all of the grain that's being grown in the world today, just the grain. Now, we're not talking about meats, we're not talking about berries, fruits, nuts, vegetables, just the grains, rice, wheat, oats, barley, etc. Every person on earth, if the grain were divided up equally, every person on earth could have about 3,600 calories worth of grain per day, and we would all be gaining weight. That's just the grain. So there is enough food out there. That's not the problem. Well, what other obstacles? Most of us are really not aware of that. I think that's one of the hurdles that we face, is that people look at the numbers and they're overwhelmed by it, and they think, well, there must not be enough to go around, but that's not the problem. A lack of awareness. What's the next obstacle? Well, we just won't get up off our rears and do anything about it, not what needs to be done. Nations have lacked the political will to address this issue. We have the capability, and I'm going to go on here in a little while to describe just how easy, really, it would be for us to address this problem. So, lack of political will is the other obstacle that I would cite here. And the final obstacle, a lack of political will. We just need to do it. The UN, nations around the world have talked about this for a long time. It's time for us to really do something about it. Well, I wanted to say something about the reasons why, although there's plenty of food out there, the reasons why we have a starvation problem, a problem with maldistribution of food. That's really the issue. It's not that there's not enough, it's being maldistributed. One of the problems, I think this is the chief problem, really, is that in this country and in many other countries around the world, food is not treated as a right, but it's treated as a commodity. And by this I mean food is treated as if it were a consumer good to be purchased and produced and bought and sold for a profit. It might seem strange to some people if we were to think, let's say, of fire protection this way. Your house catches fire, and you call the fire department, and you get somebody on the phone, and they say, well, how much are you willing to pay for us to come out and put the fire out at your home? If you'll pay us enough, we'll come out. If not, your home's going to burn. That would shock us, and we would think there was something really wrong with that. But we treat food very much the same way. We don't treat it like education. Everybody in this room has had an opportunity to go to a public school provided by the taxpayers. We don't treat food the same way. And around the world, people who can't afford food don't get it. And one of the things that I think people lack an awareness of, and the lack of awareness, I said, was an obstacle. One of the things that most Americans are not aware of is that many of our eating habits, our lifestyle, those things contribute to hunger elsewhere. Let me take one kind of outstanding example. Off the coast of South America, off the west coast of South America, Peru and Ecuador, there is a very rich source of protein, the fish catch, for many years now. Fish have been harvested off that part of the Pacific, that part of South America. Now, in South America, there are many protein-starved children, many hungry, starving, malnourished children. Well, you might say, well, the fish, right there offshore, get boats, take them to the people who need it. Well, there are there are boats harvesting those fish. But where are the fish ending up for the most part? Anybody have an idea where most of that's going? I'm an animal person. I love my pets. I feed them the stuff that's harvested off there. You do too. We're able to outbid the poor people of South America for the fish that's harvested off the coast. So our pets are eating that rather than the children of the poor. This has been going on a long, long time. Back in the 18th century, an Englishman made this complaint against the rich. He said, the horses and dogs of the rich are eating the food of the poor. Rich, more affluent consumers have always been able to outbid poor people for those resources, food included. And so I think really the key problem of maldistribution is that we treat food like a commodity. Those who offer the highest price for that commodity will get it, regardless of how many other people go without, and regardless of the fact that this is not jewelry or a motorboat we're talking about. This is something that every single person on earth has to have, food. We treat it like it's any other commodity, and that's a problem. A lot of cropland and agricultural resources in the poorest countries over the past several decades have been switched from producing staples to meet the needs of the domestic population to the production of export crops, bananas, coffee, beef, pork, things that affluent consumers can buy. And so a lot of land in South America, Africa, Asia has been diverted to that. So people in countries like Honduras are growing beef that they can't afford to eat themselves. It's shipped to the United States. And the land that used to be used to grow potatoes and other crops that fed families in those countries is being used now to satisfy the demands of affluent consumers. Another problem, and it's connected with the first one that I talked about here. In most world development programs, the attention is usually on urban settings, urban issues, wage labor in urban areas, and not enough attention has been paid to the poor farmers, the peasants who are out there struggling to try to feed their families on the most effete land, soils, the worst land, small patches that they have to try to make a living and feed their families. So development programs have shown not enough attention, not paid enough attention to the needs of small farmers. They don't get much attention because we're not very interested in what happens there. We're interested in the large agri-farms, the agribusinesses, and the urban areas. Another problem that is increasingly affecting world food supply is, of course, inclement weather. Variable weather that we think may come in part as a result of pollution, mostly pollution emitted by the affluent countries, again, the countries with lots of automobiles and factories spewing smoke. And so climate changes have produced droughts and floods, and we're seeing, I think, right now some effects that, while it's hard to say absolutely, we are causing, more severe hurricanes and more hurricanes or more floods that go with those hurricanes. The pattern fits. It makes sense, and it looks as if we're making things even harder for people to try to feed themselves. That, by the way, that was a picture of the flooding recently in Haiti. Haiti is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. It's been hit twice now in the past week by hurricanes and flooding and loss of life. Their farmland is virtually gone now. Compounding the problem now is the emphasis in some countries on biofuels, growing crops like corn and diverting that corn not away from consumption to production of energy. So we produce a lot of corn to make a gallon of fuel for our SUV. And that raises the price of corn and other grains that are used for consumers all over the world and reduces the supply. Again, it's something we're doing. It's something that we're doing. It's a conscious decision that is making life harder for a lot of people, making it almost impossible for some. Commodity speculators, we've heard a good bit about energy and commodity speculators in recent days and years. Driving up the cost of energy is affecting food production, and the distribution of food gets more expensive. Commodity speculators drive up the price of foods for poor people. Growth in China and India, especially, with their huge populations, both of them topping 1 billion people. Growth in those countries and rising incomes in those countries means that they're able to demand more energy and more food. And almost everybody in this room would know, as demand grows for something, so does the cost, so does the price of that thing. So as China and India demand more food and more energy, it drives the cost of food up and shrinks the supply available to everybody else out there, the people who are most in need. In some parts of the world, especially sub-Saharan Africa, health problems, most notably HIV/AIDS, contribute to the problem. There are millions of children in Africa today who have no parents, who are raising themselves, literally, 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds, raising 6- and 7-year-olds. No parents, nobody to guide them, nobody to grow food for them. HIV/AIDS innervates, it weakens people, of course, and they can't go out and farm. Agriculture is a very labor-intensive job. It takes a lot of effort and energy. HIV/AIDS is impairing food production in many of these countries. Another picture from Haiti recently, as the price of food was going up, beyond what so many of these people could afford, could no longer afford to feed their families. There was a kind of overthrow of the government, riots, because people literally are starving. Their families are starving, and problems associated with hunger. We don't have to talk only about starvation. Starvation is sort of the extreme expression of malnutrition, but when people are malnourished, they're especially prone to certain kinds of problems, illnesses. It weakens them. It interferes with mental processes. Starving children or malnourished children in school are not going to learn very much. Plus, their brains are not getting the nutrients that they need to develop fully, so it does impair their ability to think and reason. In some extreme cases, it makes people go blind. Certain kinds of malnutrition lead to blindness. It makes them susceptible to many illnesses. The four biggest scourges of the poor countries are diarrhea, which can be a big killer, is a big killer of children under 5. Acute respiratory illness, malaria, and measles. If you get any of these things in a weakened state, you're very vulnerable and you're far more likely to die as a result of these maladies. That drives up the infant mortality rate. It results in stunted growth, not full, healthy development of people. One of the things that you may have noticed in the news is the comments on, of course, there's a big difference between North and South Korea. South Korea is a country that is relatively affluent, in good economic shape. And North Korea is very deprived. The people there are chronically malnourished, millions and millions. The size of the people in North and South Korea is very notably different. South Koreans tend to be much taller than North Koreans. Why? It's not genetics. It's their nutrition. It's their lack of nutrition in the North that causes that stunted development. And of course, when you have people starving, it totally wrecks families, communities. People become desperate. They do desperate things. And, in this country, we talk a lot about community and family. But when people are starving in this condition, what kind of community or family do you think you can have? Well, trying to turn in a little more cheerful direction, I said to begin with that this is a scourge that is unnecessary. It's something that we don't have to have this problem in the world. Children may be born into a poor country, but as I pointed out, they're not being born into a poor world. The world has an abundance of food. What we need to do is get the food to the people who actually need it, to the children who need it. And that's who we're talking about mostly, women and children, remember. About 75% of the victims of this scourge are women and children. We need to get the food to them. It's there. We talk a lot about human rights, about appreciating and respecting human rights. Well, human rights don't end at a border. If we have people starving halfway around the world, I think we have a moral obligation to do something about that. We're in a position to do it. It's a question, really, of our priorities, and I wanted to say something about this dichotomy between spending on military and spending on peace, on meeting social needs like food, shelter, and health care, and on infrastructure, things like roads and sewage systems and all the rest. Every time, this is an old struggle. Every time we spend $1 on the military, that's $1 that we divert from education, healthcare, food, shelter, and all these other needs that we have. Well, how bad is it? You can see different numbers in different places depending on how you count it, but the United States budget these days is over $2.6 trillion a year. And if you add up everything, every expenditure that is military related, now this is not the official figure from the federal government. The federal government might tell you we're spending $500 billion a year on defense. What they don't include is interest on past wars and past military spending. They don't include Iraq and Afghanistan, where we're spending somewhere between $10 and $12 billion a month. They don't include expenditures like Veterans Administration, Homeland Security. If you add all these things up, I say about 54% of our total spending goes to military. The United States, even by our own figures, even by the figures that the Bush administration would give you, the United States is spending about the same amount on military that every other country in the world spends total. There are over 190 countries in the world, and all the rest of them together spend about the same on military as this one country, the United States. To me, that's just staggering and rather shameful, considering the other statistics I've pointed to. The United States, back in 1975, committed, along with every other developed country in the world, committed to donate 0.7%, 0.7% of our gross national product to help poor countries. That's what we committed to. How much do we actually give? Anybody know? About 0.16%. 0.16%. 0.16% of our gross national income is devoted to helping poor countries. So we're not even close. And if you look at all the developed countries, guess where the United States ranks in terms of contributions to developing countries? Sweden's at the top. Norway, Denmark, Luxembourg, they're at the top. Guess who's at the bottom? 22nd out of 22 countries. So, lack of political will. If we spent just half a month's funds that we're spending in Iraq right now, if we spent just half a month's funds, we could immunize every child in the world against preventable diseases like measles and mumps and such, and save millions of lives a year, just for a fraction of what we spend in a single month in Iraq. So, awareness. We need to be aware of this, and I think as citizens we need to expect that our politicians, that our leaders do something more about this. We're very willing as a country to sacrifice greatly for war. How much will we sacrifice for peace and social justice? Even half that amount? We send people to die in a war, and we spend billions and billions of dollars on a war, but how much will we sacrifice for peace and justice and to feed people? Well, at this point I'll turn it over to our economist.
Gary. That was excellent. Our next speaker is also no stranger to the Third World Series. Philip I. Smedra, who is Associate Professor of Economics here at GSW, is an authority on development, economics in small island developing states. He received his BA degree from Pennsylvania State University, and then he came south to Athens, Georgia, the University of Georgia, where he received his MS and PhD degrees in agricultural economics. As I said, from the University of Georgia, and then he served in the Peace Corps in Morocco, and he was employed by the government as an agricultural economist, and also taught at the University of the South Pacific in Suva, Fiji, and has visited Fiji many times. Lucky guy. And to do research. And have some fun, I guess, too.
It's just research.
Just research? Okay, that's not one. But he's the author of many refereed articles on third world agricultural problems. He's also on the board of editors of the Journal of Third World Studies, and he taught at the American University of Bulgaria during the 2006-2007 academic year, and I believe you said next month you're going to South Dakota. He's been invited by the George McGovern Center in South Dakota. George McGovern was, of course, a presidential candidate in 1972, and a U.S. senator. And Phil was invited to give a presentation on the same thing he's going to talk about tonight, the world food crisis from an economist's perspective. So incidentally, before Dr. Smedra takes over, those participation forms, the white forms, those are for my students to fill out and give me after the program. Thank you very much. Dr. Smedra.
First off, I want to thank Dr. Isaacs for putting these programs together. I think they're important for the community, they're important for the university, and they provide this great service. And he's been doing it, as Dr. Klein mentioned, for years and years, and I've been involved since I've been here, and they've been tremendously enlightening experience for me. What should I do here? Slideshow. Well, to start this off, what I want to talk about is essentially what Robert Malthus talked about 200 years ago. In 1798, Malthus, who was a British economist, but not really an economist because they didn't consider those folks to be economists back then, he talked about the population of the world growing faster than the amount of food that the world could provide. And he called this scenario a long night of hunger and drudgery. That is, the world, people would suffer starvation because populations grew geometrically and the food supply grew arithmetically. And so there was a catastrophe that was that he foresaw in the future. And the question that we have to address is whether in fact we're witnessing a Malthusian catastrophe. Is in fact the population of the globe growing faster than our ability to provide food to it? And the answer to that, and Dr. Klein mentioned this, the answer to that is no. There's sufficient food in the world. The problem is, again, as Dr. Klein mentioned, is providing this food to the people who need it. There's no overall global food shortage. As a matter of fact, in 2007, the overall grain harvest in the world was larger than it was in 2006, and that's essentially been the case for many, many years. Our technological advances in the US and in the developed world, the European Union, has caused us to be very, very bountiful. The problem is getting food to the people that need it. The other problem, more recent problem, is that the demand for food, or the goods that we consider to be food, is growing faster than the supply of food. The demand, an indirect demand, the demand for fuel, for corn ethanol, is growing faster than our ability to grow corn and provide it to ethanol producers. And also the developing world has become richer, the Chinese and the Indians. And as people become richer, they demand changes in their diets. They want protein sources that are derived from meat. And in order to grow beef and other kinds of meat, one has to provide them with, typically, grain. And that's the other reason why demand is growing at a faster pace than we can provide substantial food. This is a picture of Kenyans in Nairobi grasping for food aid. As you know, in spring there was political upheaval in Kenya, and these folks are attempting to get some food packets that are being distributed. Food prices have increased by 86% over the last 3 years, and this is how I'm going to differentiate my presentation from Dr. Klein's. We developed these independently, and there's a bit of redundance, and just bear with us, or bear with me, but I think it's good to kind of hammer home the fact of this crisis, and in fact there is a crisis. Prices have gone up, food prices globally, that is considering all kinds of commodities, by almost 100% over the past 3 years. And what this has caused is a crisis among people who simply can't afford to purchase food. This is a picture of folks in Pakistan queuing at a government food shop and being squeezed against the glass partition. These two folks at the right, squeezed against this glass partition by the group of people behind them. And forgive me for, again, being redundant, but this particular picture astounded me. I didn't realize that people actually ate dirt in the world. Again, it's the same photo. It's not quite the same photo. This is a woman who's baking, using the sun, what are called mud cakes. Mud cookies in Dr. Klein's presentation, but mud cakes. This is dirt with a bit of margarine and a bit of sugar to make it palatable, and she's baking them and about to sell them. This is what people eat in Haiti. This is Port-au-Prince, capital of Haiti, in order to calm hunger pangs. This was, I saw Dr. Klein's presentation before he presented it, but I wanted to keep this photo of this person baking mud cakes for distribution because I think it's shocking. So what's happened here is we've entered a new era of a great deal of pressure on our food supply, not simply because of increasing population, but because now we're diverting food to non-food uses, and that's the major issue. And this particular problem affects a great many countries throughout the world, throughout the developing world, and is causing political instability in some of those countries. Here's a graphic that provides us with some information about what's going on with price of two principal food commodities, wheat and rice. And notice the spikes. Beginning in 2007 for wheat, and just this year, January of 2008, the price of rice has gone up by 140%. And as you know, most of the world, in the eastern part of the world, eats rice. The world map indicates the little don't go signs indicate countries that have implemented export bans. That is, their own domestic agriculture cannot export to the world market because those countries are concerned about their own domestic supply. So now there are legal export bans in all of these countries that are marked. And also a little fist in the air indicates where there's been civic unrest, upheaval And as Dr. Klein mentioned, in Haiti, the government was actually overthrown and a new prime minister put in place. But this is a natural reaction to not having this basic necessity of life. What would you do if you didn't have access to food? I mean, I would be at the barricades, I think. I'm sure that I would be at the barricades, and I hope you folks would be right behind me. This is something that revolutions, something that creates revolutions. Not enough food? Well, the government's got to go. And we'll have access to food. Here's a woman that's looking for rice that's grains of rice that have fallen off a delivery truck in Bangladesh. Since just the past year, the price of food has gone up by 41%, average, all over the world. When the price of food increases by 20%, about 100 million people are forced back to living on $1 a day. So if this metric is correct, that means over the past 12 months, that 200 million people have been thrown back into this category of abject poverty, $1 a day. Again, I mentioned that just this year, from January to July, the price of rice has increased by 140%. Food price increases inconvenience us as Americans. We don't like to pay more for whatever we need to pay at the supermarket. It's an inconvenience because we only pay 10% of on average, of our income for food. The poorest people in the United States spend about 16% of their total income on food. So when food prices increase, what we need to do is kind of rearrange our budget. Less for recreation, more for food. It's not a big issue. But if food makes up 65 to 75, or sometimes 100% of your budget, and the prices of the food that you're consuming increase, there is no shifting in your budget. You have no recourse, except the barricades. And one of the sad things about this is that over the past 15 years, globalization has brought literally hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. The market has brought these people from abject poverty into some kind of a middle class that is different than our middle class, but nonetheless a middle class. And the threat now is that many millions of these people will be thrown back into poverty. This is, again, a picture from Haiti, and these students are eating their one meal a day, rice and beans. That's been contributed by some aid organization. Their one meal a day. These are farmers in Mexico. Some statistics from the United Nations, the Food and Agricultural Organization, a part of the UN, saying that the stocks of cereals in the world are at their lowest levels since 1982. The amount that we produce every year increases, but overall stocks, because we've been consuming more than we've been producing, have decreased. Wheat prices, as we saw, have never been higher. Corn prices have doubled since 2006, and that causes civil unrest. It would if I was affected. I'd be out there. I mean, I wouldn't care if the police beat me up. I would be out there demonstrating my displeasure with this situation. And that's what happens. That's what's happened, and that's what continues to happen in many countries of the world, many of them in Africa. This is a picture of Abidjan in Cote d'Ivoire, which had food riots, as did many of those other countries that we demonstrated on the map. Here's a fellow once again in Haiti, and he's confronting a blue helmet, a United Nations peacekeeper. And notice what he's got on his plate. That's grass. He's demonstrating that he has nothing to eat except for grass. So, food riots in Haiti. The Egyptian army is baking bread for the population because many people can no longer afford this basic necessity of life. In Pakistan, the government there has introduced ration cards to ration the short supply of rice and wheat that's available. This is a picture of folks queuing for free food in Rawalpindi, Pakistan, which is it's the old city right next to Islamabad, the capital. The causes of this significant problem that we're facing, the oil price spike, has caused agricultural production to the costs of producing agricultural goods to increase because, as you know, fertilizer. Many fertilizers, chemical fertilizers, are derived from petroleum. Also, the cost of transport has caused food prices to increase. Also, there's been a significant epic drought in Australia and in southern Africa, which has caused Australia is the second biggest producer of wheat and exporter to the global market in the world. And if they're not producing wheat, that means that stocks of wheat that are available on the global market decrease, and also floods in West Africa. And the other significant cause is this conversion of what used to be food, corn in the United States, to ethanol, a push to develop and produce biofuels. And the second point is an interesting point. Corn ethanol production in the U.S. accounted for half the rise in global corn demand in each of the past 3 years. The price of corn has doubled over the past 2 years. This is the reason why. 1.3 billion bushels of corn every year now in the United States go toward ethanol production, when they could be going for food production. And of course, farmers responding to these high prices of corn have converted from soybean production and from wheat production into corn production. That's what the market demands. It demands that farmers respond to this higher price. And so that's what's happened. More acreage in corn production, much less acreage in these other basic cereal production in the U.S. And here's something that most people don't know. Many people know that ethanol is subsidized by the government. The production of ethanol, corn ethanol in the U.S. is subsidized by 51 cents a gallon. If the government didn't provide this subsidy, it would not be efficient for corn growers in the United States to produce corn. They could not afford to do it. That's one aspect. The other aspect is that the federal government in the United States imposes a 54 cent a gallon tariff, a tax, on imported ethanol, which means that ethanol that could be imported from Brazil, and Brazil is a very efficient producer of ethanol. It doesn't use corn. Some of you know that it uses sugarcane, but not actual sugarcane. It uses what's called bagasse, which is the sugarcane after it's been crushed. So there's no food situation that is being avoided. They're using this residue to produce ethanol at much cheaper prices than we can produce it. And it's not a food source for, it could be a cattle food source, but not for human beings. We don't eat crushed sugarcane residue. So, and the difference, you can see the difference in the two prices. The difference in their production costs and our production costs is about $1 a gallon. They can produce it at $1 a gallon cheaper than we can produce it using sugarcane bagasse rather than corn in the U.S. We need to do something about that, probably. Another cause is something called the Washington Consensus. Washington Consensus is the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And for many years, during what were called structural adjustment programs, getting developing countries engaged in market activity, people from the World Bank visited these countries and said that they needed to convert from food production over to cash crop production. And Dr. Klein mentioned a bit about that. And that's caused less food to be produced in some of these countries and more cash crops like palm oil and coconut and sugarcane that's exported into the world market, less food available domestically. These are kids in Mogadishu in Somalia on a trash pile looking for food. The increased demand for Western diets in China and India has caused an increased demand for meatier diets. People want to eat meat. As soon as they can afford it, that's what they go for. And in order to produce meat, as you know, you've got to provide cows with some kind of grain, or pigs with some kind of grain. That's not absolutely necessary, but usually cows fatten up much quicker and the meat is tastier if you give them grain rather than grass. Just some statistics: 4 pounds of animal feed, that is grain, to produce 1 pound of beef. So the conversion is very inefficient. Better to eat the grain than put it into a cow, kill the cow, and eat the meat. Much more efficient. Seriously, much more efficient. And here's the other problem. Although it's a very attractive Chevrolet SUV. It requires about 240 kilograms of corn, about 530 pounds of corn, which is enough to feed one person for a year. One person for an entire year. That can be converted to about 100 liters of ethanol, 26 gallons of ethanol, which, given about 12 or 13 or 14 miles to the gallon, can power this car for about 300 miles. So that's the trade-off. You power the car for 300 miles, or you have enough grain to feed an individual for an entire year. And the irony of this, and Dr. Isaacs mentioned that I'm involved in research in the South Pacific. The big issue in the South Pacific is not hunger, it's obesity. People are way too overweight. So we have 800 million people in the world that are hungry, that are malnourished, and we have 1 billion people that are overweight. And so, policymakers focus on one group or the other, but the overweight folks can wait, as far as I'm concerned. The problem is with feeding these folks. Some more problems, and we'll be done here in just a few minutes. There are laws, U.S. laws, that say that any kind of food aid that the United States provides has to be sourced in the United States. That is, if we're providing corn, if we're providing wheat, it has to be American corn. It has to be American wheat. It can't be sourced. If you're providing food to people in Somalia or in Chad or in Sudan, it has to be American grain. And it has to be transported on American ships. Think of how more efficient we could be if we could source this grain from South Africa, which has a big output of, usually in most years, of wheat, and just truck it up to the countries in the Horn of Africa that need this food. Also, we have this point about 65% of all our aid monies go for administrative costs and transport. So 65 cents out of every dollar that we spend on aid, and we spend very few dollars on aid, as Dr. Klein mentioned. 0.16% of our gross domestic product goes toward aid, and only about 35% of that minuscule amount actually gets to the people that are targeted. We talked about that. U.S. flagged ships, which are much more expensive than if we put grain on a Liberian flagged ship, for instance. American flagged ships have rules and regulations and costs that are much more expensive than other countries. Solutions. This whole crisis may be a challenge to globalization, because countries that have bought into globalization, signed on to the World Trade Organization, have all agreed to decrease their trade barriers, but it's going all out the window. Many countries are now afraid that their populations are at risk of starvation, and so now they've closed off their borders. So everybody's rethinking this notion of globalization that has brought literally hundreds of millions of people out of poverty into a middle class. The third point here, markets should be liberalized rather than further government intervention. And what I mean by that is subsidies for corn ethanol and acreage restrictions, which we have here in the United States, should be done away with. There's no reason at all for American agriculture to be subsidized as far as corn ethanol production goes. And also, there's a need for food in the world that American agriculture can provide. There is absolutely no rationale to have acreage restriction programs in place. Farmers getting paid to not produce. Also, the subsidies to biofuels should be eliminated. If in fact the biofuel industry in the United States can afford to operate, can produce biofuels profitably, then it should be allowed to do so. And if it can't, then there's all this corn, this 1.3 billion bushels of corn that go toward ethanol production in the U.S., should not be produced. And we, in fact, should be importing ethanol from Brazil, who can produce it at a much cheaper rate than we can. That's rapeseed, by the way. Rapeseed is an industrial crop. Rapeseed is used for, it's crushed and used for its oil. This fellow is a Darfuri in the Sudan, and he's holding up a can of palm oil. Export quotas, trade restrictions should be eliminated. In fact, rather than restricting output of agricultural commodities, what we should be doing, what we should be promoting is more free trade, so that that producers in Africa and producers in Australia and producers in the United States can produce for the world market without any kinds of restrictions. That would benefit, actually that would benefit the third world much more than it would benefit people in the West, farmers in the West, another Darfuri in a refugee camp. Source food aid from neighboring countries. It makes no sense to buy food from the United States, put it on an American flagged ship, and ship it, which takes a month at the very least, to the Horn of Africa. Source this food from Africa or another country that's much closer to the problem area, and put this food on whatever ship is available. It doesn't need to be an American flagged cargo transport. The government does in fact have a role to play. It needs to promote technology, and not technology that's focused on the developed world. What we need is more institutes, agricultural institutes that are devoted to developing new technologies for the developing world. We're very productive here in the United States. We have land-grant institutions in every state of the United States. The people at the University of Georgia are concerned about producing better cotton, more productive soybeans, more soybean bushels per acre. We would suggest that a great deal of that effort should be focused on the developing world, because we're as productive as we need to be in the U.S. Increase productivity through intensive rather than extensive methods. An issue here is that because there's now a great demand for corn to be converted into ethanol, that people in the U.S. or people in other countries in the Brazilian rainforest will cut down those trees in order to convert those trees to farmland. There's this great demand for meat. One way to provide more grazing area for cows is to cut down the rainforest. So rather than extensive methods to increase agricultural production, what we need is intensive methods, and that's arrived at new technologies. And finally, I can't agree more with Dr. Klein. What we need to do is focus on individuals that are in need, almost 1 billion people that require food aid. And again, I think probably we all could agree that food is a basic human right. No individual should have to choose between shelter and food or clothing and food. Everyone should have access, at the very least, to a sufficient diet. And that's, I think, all we have.
Okay, we had some time for questions. I'm sure there are some questions of all this good information. Yes, sir.
So this is more for Dr. Semestra. I know you mentioned the price of rice increasing, and I was wondering maybe you could allude to what would be the cause of it. I know for a fact that recently the government Thailand was overthrown and military takeover, and they're developing a new constitution, yet there's still some social problems going on. I know they're the largest exporter of rice. Is that in any way affecting it, or is it some other problem?
I'm sure that the civil strife in Thailand, which you're right is the biggest exporter, Vietnam is also a big exporter to the world market. But I mentioned that many of these countries that were exporting rice to the global market now have imposed export bans, which causes the price of rice, the supply of rice on global markets to decrease and the price to increase. That's what's causing this. That's what's caused this huge price spike in rice of 140%.
Yes, Brian?
Both of you mentioned that the issue is not the global supply of food and not the amount of food being produced. Does that take into consideration the lack of sustainability of the current rate of agricultural production, particularly as concerns fresh water supplies and the draining of aquifers?
Well, that's an issue that has to be addressed, certainly. We could have a whole program on the coming crisis in drinkable water sources, but of course agriculture does need to be sustainable. It does need to be replicable over many generations, and I think the kind of commercial agriculture that's been going on is not sustainable, and at the same time is compounding the problem of hunger. We need to move away from the sort of industrial model of agriculture and go to the kind of thing I believe Dr. Smedra was talking about, with an emphasis on the particular needs of the third world, intensive agriculture of small plots. The distribution of land is very unequal now throughout the world, and a lot of these people have lost what little bit of land they had to feed their families, and there needs to be a redistribution of all kinds of resources to keep the system sustainable over the long run, I think.
Let me also add that organic agriculture is not going to do it. It's not going to provide the amount of food that the world needs. It's nice to go to Vermont, and it's nice to see how those folks provide lettuce and radishes to the local market. But as far as feeding the people in Africa, we need, and this might be a bit of a disagreement here, we need industrial agriculture. It's the way that this country has become very productive. It's unfortunately the way that we've used a great many agricultural chemicals. It's the way that we've drained the Ogallala Aquifer in the Midwest United States. Those are issues that commercial agriculture has to address, but going to some kind of organic agriculture that's kind of a touchy-feely agriculture won't work. It won't feed the people of the world.
So is it going to become a problem then, that there won't be enough food to feed everyone, because we are currently producing food at the rate to feed everyone, but India, for example, would have to cut its agricultural production by 6 times. It's currently draining its aquifers to produce its agricultural rate at a rate 6 times of what is sustainable. So you can imagine the drop in food production in India alone as soon as their aquifers drain out. And so we can say today that there's enough food to go around, even if you take into transportation costs and all the other problems that are involved. But is it going to be sustainable in the future too? Because just based on there's enough food.
I think one of the issues is efficiency. I mentioned that American agriculture is the most efficient agriculture in the world. But in the U.S., it's American agriculture that uses about 90% of the water that's used. Whether it's the West, whether it's the South, whether it's the eastern part of the U.S., agriculture uses 9/10 of all the water that's used in agricultural production. And therefore, agriculture has to be more aware of efficient ways to use that water. Because yes, it's going to be a huge issue in the future, and probably not the too distant future. Thanks.
Yes, sir. Question.
Water doesn't disappear, you can purify it, so why not just build water plants that could treat the water treatment facilities? Then you can solve the water.
What did he say?
So you can build water treatment plants to purify the water, so water's not an issue.
Sheer volume. Sheer volume. The sheer volume, the number of plants, desalinization plants that you're talking about would be not only incredibly expensive, but you'd have to have a massive number.
Yes, but that would also increase the jobs for the U.S.
Well, somebody's going to have to pay for that. And as Dr. Smith mentioned, desalinization is a very expensive proposition. Taking salt water and making it fresh, or taking dirty water and making it clean. And the question is, who in fact is going to pay for that? If you're agreed that the American taxpayer is going to pay for that, you'll have a hard time being elected, I think, because the American taxpayer is is not tuned into that kind of an issue currently.
Okay, well, thank you for your participation and your interest, and let's give our two speakers a great ovation.